on today's edition of Stories from Real Life with Melvin E. Edwards. Our guest today is military historian Patrick Naughton. April 15th, 2025 is the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon that ended the Vietnam War. Naughton's new book, Born from War, a soldier's quest to understand Vietnam, Iraq, and the generational impact of conflict, recognizes this milestone and examines the raw memories of the recent decades of conflict.
The military is a reflection of the society that it serves. So for those who think that the military is this different beast, if you will, that's not going to have the same societal problems, that's just false. Our soldiers come from the society that we serve. To think that somehow somebody just puts on a uniform and all of a sudden, racism's going to go away and sexism's going to go away and any of the other societal problems, that's just not true.
Let's join today's episode with military historian and author Patrick Naughton.
You are listening to Stories from Real Life, a podcast by engaging storytellers for engaged story listeners. Here's your host, author and journalist, Melvin E. Edwards.
Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. Thanks for joining me for the podcast where personal stories can have a global impact. As you heard in the intro, my guest is author Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Naughton. Hello, sir, and thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this discussion, and thanks for wearing your Army shirt and not wearing an Air Force or a Navy shirt. I might have just hung up if you did that, but
I wasn't even in the Army, and I don't know where I got this shirt from, but I decided to wear it today.
Nice.
So I'm down here in South Texas, and I understand you were stationed in Texas 3 times, once in Dallas and twice in San Antonio, and you once volunteered at the Alamo. What do you remember about those Texas experiences?
Yeah, no. So my first time in Texas was in the Dallas area. I was there for 3 years. I didn't know my wife then. So that was my first duty assignment as a brand new second lieutenant. So didn't know anything about Texas. Went to Dallas, this massive city. Dallas Fort Worth area. Driving through there and just being blown away how large it was. Coming from Hawaii growing up. So that was kind of interesting, and then but I really enjoyed it. I really liked Texas. The food, was incredible. The people are very nice. It's really hot, but besides that, it was a great place. And then after that, once I met my wife, we went to San Antonio. We were there for a year. Really loved San Antonio. The Army moved us again. Then we came back about a year and a half later for another year in San Antonio again. So if I had to choose, Texas, it would probably be San Antonio. And volunteering at the Alamo was a really great, fun time. I love history, so I got to nerd out every weekend doing that.
That's fun. Houston happens to be my hometown. I live 20 minutes from San Antonio now, but Houston's my hometown. And if you talk about food, if you're a foodie, Houston's the place to go.
No, I got to check it out. Never been to Houston.
People are surprised that it's the most diverse city in the country. There are 145 languages spoken in Houston.
Wow.
And
yeah, I know from researching for my book that there's a large Vietnamese community in Houston. Mm-hmm. That's one of the areas that they settled.
Yes, absolutely. All right, so the title of your new book is Born from War, A Soldier's Quest to Understand Vietnam, Iraq, and the Generational Impact of Conflict. First, congrats on the new book. It's very well written.
Oh, thank you, sir.
So your book offers a unique insight into the intergenerational impact of modern war on American military families, told through the experiences of a father and a son. So my first question for you is, what does your dad think of the book?
Yeah, no, I think he, was kind of blown away that I wanted to write it. He had saved all his letters that he wrote home from Vietnam, as well as a diary that he kept in Vietnam. And once he kind of rediscovered all that material as he was moving, he mentioned it to me, and I think maybe he was kind of a little blown away how excited I was about it and wanted to read through that stuff and maybe do something with it. And I had always thought once I started writing articles and so on, starting in about 2017, that I wanted to do a book, but I didn't really have an idea. And once I got a hold of that stuff, it really clicked that this would be an awesome way to explore two generations of conflict and how that influences the family as a whole. So I think, yeah, he's been really blown away by it. He still hasn't he's seen the finished PDF product, but he doesn't have the actual book in his hand yet. That's on his way in the mail right now to him. So I think he's going to be blown away once he finally gets it in his hands.
So this episode is scheduled to release on April 15th, which is the day your book is officially released. So hopefully he will get a chance to be one of the first ones to get the hard copy and have you sign it for him if he wants your signature on something. So what was the most surprising thing you learned about your dad during your talks with his fellow Vietnam vets?
Yeah, I researched, I tracked down a bunch of guys that he served with. And one of them was actually local here at Fort Leavenworth, where I'm stationed now, which was kind of surprising to find him here. But I tracked down a number of them, and all of them were very surprised that this person just kind of, showed up out of nowhere and started asking them about their Vietnam experience, 50, 60 years ago. Especially I'm a junior, so with the same name of the guy that they served with so long ago. And so, all of it was really surprising because there was no agenda when I reached out to them and just asked them about my father's, if they knew him and what he was like. And all of them basically said, oh, your dad was a hero. Your dad was Bronze Star winner with V for Valor. And all that was unsolicited on my part. It was just something they just immediately offered up right away. And so learning this about your father, when you think of your father, you don't really think of him in that way. Even though I kind of grew up with that in the background a little bit, that he had served in Vietnam, but I didn't really know much about it. So that was kind of interesting to get this perspective of him that I did not know. And obviously, he was a young man then, no thoughts of me or my sister at all. So it was just learning about this man who my only memory of him is from him as a father, and not this young man who's, out chasing girls and, fighting in a war and all these other things that young men do. So that was kind of really, really interesting.
That's really cool. So today's military recruits primarily come from families like yours with a history of service. You volunteered to join while your dad's generation was selected to serve, often involuntarily. So do you think your son will follow in your footsteps, and do you want him to?
Yeah, I want him to make his own choices, obviously. My dad, he didn't force me or influence me to try to join the Army. He never talked about it growing up, but it was something that was always in the background. When you're a little kid, you like dig around through your parents' stuff and sneak through their stuff. And so I would find old pieces of uniform and old medals and ribbons and things and not really know what that stuff meant. But it had a huge influence on why I joined the Army, because that's something that I thought, that's how you become a man. That's what the corny 1980s war movies told me as well. So he didn't influence me in any way, and I think when I said, hey, I'm joining the Army, I was kind of a troubled kid, got in a lot of trouble. I think he was just happy that I was doing something with my life. But for my son, it's going to be I think an even bigger influence for him because, now there's a book that talks about his grandfather and myself serving in the Army, so I don't know how he's not going to be influenced by it. But, if he wants to join, it's completely up to him. We'll support him. If he doesn't, then that's perfectly fine as well.
You're a military historian, and so several of my questions today will be based on that type of a context. So one of the things that I've thought about over the years is it seems like the end of one war is almost like a pretext to the beginning of the next one. Do you think there would have been a war on terror without a Gulf War, Vietnam without Korea, or World War II without World War I?
Absolutely. That's a very astute point. Every conflict, really, especially at the tail end of it, there's always signs of what the next conflict's going to be like. So you look at the end of the American Civil War, you're seeing trench warfare, and then you get into trench warfare, World War I. And then in World War I, that's really kind of the first death of nationalism, and you see all that break apart. And that's where you see all the tensions that arise today, in the Middle East, in Africa, even in Europe. And then you go into World War II and all the tensions that happen there, all the things that are still resonating till today. So, yes, absolutely. There are, each conflict leads to the next one. If you look at Vietnam, that was against Korea, that was against communism. And then when we went into Vietnam, we tried to build the South Vietnamese army in the model of what we did in Korea. So another huge influence there, and the same thing, trying to stop the communists, the domino theory and all that stuff. And then the first Gulf War, that sets the conditions for later what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. So 100% that the conflict foretells, what's going to be the next conflict, and the cessation of conflict shapes where those next, flames are going to kind of rise up, and when that next conflict is going to rise. So right now, there's a lot of historians and national security experts and so on that think that we are in the interwar years again. That right now it's shaping up the interwar years between World War I and World War II. They weren't called the interwar years when that was occurring, but we're kind of reading the tea leaves, if you will, and almost thinking that right now is the interwar years as we prepare for probably a next large-scale conflict, whether it's going to be in Europe or Asia, unknown at this time, or both. But I definitely think that we are in the interwar years, on the verge of some type of new large-scale conflict in the future.
Wow. I'm guessing your dad isn't old enough that he experienced Pearl Harbor, but obviously not there, but old enough to remember it. But the two of you did experience this generation's Pearl Harbor together in 9/11. What do you remember about that day?
Yeah, that was just a funny coincidence, right? He was actually visiting us in Hawaii. My sister and I, we had shared an apartment, and I had gotten off active duty as an enlisted soldier, and I was in the National Guard, the Hawaii National Guard. And I was actually driving I had like a little injury on my wrist, and I was driving to Tripler that morning that the attacks happened. So my dad was staying with us, and so that was kind of the verge of cell phones were just coming out then and so on. So I was driving to the base, and I didn't have the radio on because it's Hawaii and it's beautiful in the morning, and I like to have the windows down when that was happening. And then I hit dead traffic on the H1 freeway at 5:30 in the morning, which is a very rare. And I turned on the radio, and it was in the midst of the attacks, due to the time zone. So I'm trying to call back to the apartment where my dad is sleeping, and no one's answering. And finally, when I burst into the door, I'm like, "We're under attack!" Thinking that everybody thought we were under attack. No one had any idea what was happening. So I was curious that I'm there with my dad. I immediately start packing my gear. My boots were still muddy from the weekend training we had, so I was shining my boots, because you're not going to get caught with dirty boots. And so I was like preparing for a war, packing, basically getting ready, thinking that we were about to get mobilized, and maybe troops were going to fall from the sky or whatever was going to happen. So that was kind of interesting that my dad was there at that exact moment when he thought, oh, maybe we're at the verge of another world war. My son's literally about to go out the door again.
Wow. So your book is being released on the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, which signaled the official end of the Vietnam War. What has that storyline meant to our American military culture since 1975?
Yeah, Vietnam is the ghost of Vietnam. It's been around for a long time. When I was working in Congress, you saw that every day, the ghost of Vietnam, and that was always the every time you discussed military options or military response to any threat in the world, it was always thrown on the table. Oh, are we trying to get into one more Vietnam? And that was always there. That ghost is always there. I write about that in the book. And then you look at Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's eerily similar. A lot of the same mistakes that we made in those our advising efforts to the local troops, to the national policy decisions that we made, and so on. So it's really interesting. So I think we have that Vietnam experience, and now we have this Iraq and Afghanistan experience. So all of that is going to influence how we make national policy, strategic decisions in the future. And so now it's not going to be, oh, do you want to do another Vietnam? Now it's going to be, oh, do we want to get into another Iraq and Afghanistan? And then you look at the tail end of Afghanistan, whether you fall on the right or you fall on the left, there's no way that you can say our exit from Afghanistan did not look exactly like our exit from Saigon in 1975. So some more eerie similarities there as well.
One of the things I noticed in your book is you talked about some of the derogatory names that were casually used for the Vietnamese people. Psychologically, is it necessary to dehumanize an enemy in order to kill him in war and not lose your own sanity?
I think, I don't know if it's necessary, but I think it's one of those unwritten things that occur in war. You try to rationalize why you are there, what you are doing, and unfortunately for human nature, it makes it easier to do violence if you can dehumanize that enemy or take a face off of them. And so you see these words being used to describe our Vietnamese enemy, and then later in Iraq and Afghanistan, those derogatory terms that everybody used, including senior leaders, etc., in briefings and so on. So it becomes kind of normal, and it becomes a way to operate, I guess, a way to rationalize, accept, understand, and continue, doing whatever you are doing in that conflict.
My father-in-law was a Vietnam veteran, and he died in 2021, years after Vietnam, but almost directly because of the trauma he experienced while he was there. I can go into more details if you'd like me to, but you probably sort of get an idea of what I mean. We're all familiar with the term PTSD and the effects of it. In World War I, we called it shell shock. Has the military learned anything about the psyche of its fighting troops in that 100 years since World War I?
Absolutely. I think that's probably one of the positive things to come out of Iraq and Afghanistan is that the military has really taken that more seriously. Like you said, World War I, you had shell shock, and there was different names for it throughout the different conflicts. But it was almost seen as a weakness. It was seen as the soldiers did not want to admit that they were having psychological issues and so on. And so if they did, they were definitely ostracized. They could lose their security clearance. They could lose their job, all those types of things. So the military today, in the past 2 decades of conflict, has really worked hard to destigmatize that and get support to troops that they need and so on. So I think that's definitely one of the good news stories to come out of Iraq and Afghanistan is the understanding and the acceptance and the willingness and the encouragement towards troops to seek help if you need it and to not just suffer in silence like the Vietnam generation definitely did.
I understand it's been a challenge for the military to recruit members, especially ones who didn't have a legacy like we talked about earlier. Do you think there's any chance the country could be forced to reconstitute the draft?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's definitely a tool that we have to do that. If we get into another large-scale conflict with a peer adversary, there is no way that we would be able to counter that threat without redoing the draft. So that's 100%, I think, going to be on the table. I think the question may be, do we extend the draft not just to males but to females as well? That's probably a valid question that needs to be discussed. But you're right. The Vietnam was a huge draft army. I mean, we fought the global wars on terrorism completely on a volunteer army. So I would use that to say anybody who thinks that today's generation no longer has the mettle that our World War II generation did and so on, that look at the men and women who joined after 9/11, whatever service they joined. Every single one of them knew that they were probably going to be sent to war, like no question of it, and they still volunteered to go. So I always push back on anybody who says that today's younger generation no longer has what it takes. I point to that as an example of how they do.
As you mentioned earlier, you're originally from Hawaii, and you're a United States Army officer and a military historian. You're now serving at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Could any states be any more different than Hawaii and Kansas?
Yeah, I mean, there's no ocean anywhere nearby here. Definitely, Hawaii is a very unique and a very beautiful culture that's not really replicated anywhere else in the world. I mean, different parts of Polynesia and so on, but it's a beautiful melting pot of all types of different cultures that have immigrated there over the years to work in the sugarcane or work in tourism or whatever it is. So it's really a unique place that I hope everybody gets a chance to visit in their life at least once if they can. But yeah, very, very different here in Kansas. One thing about people from Hawaii is wherever we end up, the first thing we do is search out for other people from Hawaii, and then we try to build like a little local community, if you will. So same thing, doing that here in Kansas or anywhere else. Texas has a big local population as well from Hawaii, so that's interesting.
Wow, that's pretty cool. So as part of your military historical background, I have a question. Baseball was integrated before the military was, but the military became, I think, the closest thing the country's ever come to being a fully integrated society. Does the military still have a functional role in societal change?
Absolutely. That's an awesome question. The military is a reflection of the society that it serves. So, for those who thinks that the military is this different beast, if you will, that's not going to have the same societal problems, that's just false. I mean, our soldiers come from the society that we serve. So to think that somehow somebody just puts on a uniform and all of a sudden, racism's going to go away and sexism's going to go away and any of the other societal problems, that's just not true. Now, being in the military, we have a different set of rules. We have a different set of bonding that happens. So a lot of that does kind of go away, especially in combat units and so on, because you become very close very, very quickly. So a lot of that does disappear. But the military cannot be different than the society that it serves. It can't be morphed into this different beast and somehow it's gonna attract recruits and then retain soldiers because of this different bar that it's set for itself or whatever it is. But we absolutely do have a responsibility to be that safe space for society for our young men and women to join, serve, and then leave the military when they're done, go back into society, a healthy, productive person into that community, because it is a revolving door. We take from society, we serve, and then that person goes back into society again. So we have a huge responsibility to treat that relationship, treasure that relationship that we have with society as a whole. You mentioned earlier about that kind of 1%, if you will, who joins the military. Like my family is because they had somebody who was in the military, a father, a mother, an uncle, a brother, sister, and that's what influenced them to join. But there's this whole other part of the population who does not have that and has not had someone that they've known that has served, so it doesn't influence them. It doesn't make them want to join, and that's a bad thing, I think.
So during your time in uniform, you mentioned in your book that you saw a spike in female enlisted service members. Can you tell me what kinds of lessons you learned from Donna Allen?
Yeah, Donna Allen, my good friend, she lives in Sikeston, Missouri, so only a couple of hours from here, actually. So yeah, when I first joined the Army, 1996, a long time ago, and I was in the infantry for my first 6 years in the Army. So in my brigade, it's like 5,000 soldiers. There was one female, and that was it, and she was in the headquarters as a clerk or something. And now, I don't know the exact percentages what it is, but I think it's up to 30-40% almost of women in the Army, and I think it's an awesome thing. And so my friend Donna, my war buddy, if you will. And so when you think of a war buddy, you think of a male. It's going to be a male. So she's a 6-foot African-American female who became very close with, she's still one of my best friends. We don't talk as often as we probably should anymore, but became almost like a sister, mother figure to me, if you will. She's a little bit older than me. And so that's just interesting, about the Army and society as a whole, that when you think of war buddies and you think of movies, it's like it's a bunch of white males maybe, and it's not necessarily always the case. So I think it's a great thing. Women in the Army have been awesome. Women are very smart. They're very organized. They're very able to do multiple things at once. And so I think it's an awesome thing. And I've served with some incredible women who I've considered mentors still to this day, who are now general officers. So yeah, I think it's an awesome thing.
You mentioned earlier that you were a little bit of a troublemaker when you were a teenager. And when you were at Mililani High School, there was a frustrated teacher she was frustrated because of you, and that she called the recruiting officer to get you out of her class. So would that teacher now be surprised that you have a master's degree?
No, I think she probably would. I probably should reach out to her and send her the book, right? Because I was taken out of school and put in like taken out of the regular classes and put into the troublemaker classes, because I was always cutting school and I was into gangs and things like that. And so one day she was frustrated at me and she's like, "Oh, what are you going to do with your life?" And I was like, F you, I'm going to join the Army. I don't care. And so she was like, okay. And so, like 20 minutes or 10 minutes later, she comes back and says, oh, here's a phone call for you. There was, phones in the classroom in case the kids made trouble. And so I went over there and I picked up the phone like, hello. And it was a recruiter. So she had called an Army recruiter and Staff Sergeant Kamakahi from Hawaii. And she was like, meet me by the flagpole after school. And I was like, oh, okay. And so that's how I joined the Army. And, so had she not given me that push, I don't even know if she was like legally allowed to do that, honestly, to call a recruiter. I'm not sure if that would fly today, but she did it, thankfully so. And, and there I was. And so joined the Army because of that push, or I guess, or that connection that she forced on me.
And she
which
called
is a good
your
thing.
bluff right there in the middle
Yeah,
of the
she sure did.
Did you resent that at all?
No, I was kind of like, I was I think I was about 17. Yeah, I was 17 at the time, and so I really had no idea what I was going to do with my life. So it was welcomed, I think, secretly. And because, once I met her, it was just, it just happened right after that, like, and the next thing you know, I was off in basic training. So I think probably secretly I was, not secretly, I was looking for something, but I didn't know what I was looking for. And thankfully the Army was the right answer for me.
Okay. So when you were over there in the deserts of the Middle East, did you think about all the things that you had left behind in Hawaii?
Yeah, at that point, and it's kind of funny because even now, I've spent more time off the island than I have on the island. So, at that point, I had already, lived in the mainland for a long time. So it wasn't as such a culture shock anymore at that point. And then even the Middle East, I'm actually quarter Lebanese. So my grandmother was Lebanese. So I had some experience with Arabic culture and so on. So it's a beautiful culture, the Middle East. If you've never been over there, it's very, very fascinating place to be. I mean, obviously go to the safe areas, but it's a beautiful culture, beautiful people, and I really enjoyed. I don't want to say enjoyed, but any interaction that I had with Iraqis, that was a positive interaction, obviously a safe interaction. I really enjoyed talking to them and learning more about their life and so on.
All right. So your profile that we linked up on Podmatch, your profile says you speak Hawaiian Pidgin.
Yeah.
And that's one of my favorite dialects. On my Bible app, I set it on Hawaiian Pidgin just because I like it.
No way. All right.
It's got an audio version of it.
Yeah.
So can you say something in Pidgin and then translate it to how it goes into what we might call Midwestern English?
Midwestern. Yeah, so the background of Pidgin, I kind of cover that for a second. It's in Hawaii, once the white culture came, so the Western culture came, they brought with them diseases, obviously, as they do, everywhere they went in North America and so on, and South America. So you had this drastic population of Native Hawaiians that died off, and then you had Americans mostly that were planting sugarcane, and so Hawaii became this big sugarcane industry, and they didn't have the workers to work in the field, so they started bringing in all these workers from different countries. So they brought Filipinos, Koreans, Portuguese, Puerto Ricans, everybody, a whole bunch of different Japanese. And so all these different people came and they were working on the sugarcane fields together. And they had this, they had the foreman was usually a native Hawaiian. So all these people couldn't talk to each other. So they created this language, and it became known today as Hawaiian Pidgin, and it was a way to everybody to talk to each other. And so it has a basis in English and Hawaiian, and then a whole bunch of different words, and it's a very abbreviated language so that it's easy to understand, and then it has a intonation that kind of goes up and down very fast. So to say, like, let's say I would read your background, so I would say, oh, Mel's background gets stories from real life. How's that one? Me, nah? And what I just said is that sign behind you, the stories from real life sign, is very interesting to see, is basically what I just said.
Okay, I would not have guessed that.
Yeah. And we have a lot of words that mean multiple things. So say we have some similar friends and we were to meet up, and I would say, hey, how's it, Mel? Where the kind them stay? And what I just said is, where is, say we know somebody named Jim. Oh, where is Jim, our normal friend that we both haven't seen in a while? So we have a lot of words that mean multiple things, and it's just the context that you use it in.
Did you use that in just everyday language?
Oh yeah, growing up, I mean, that was our language every day in school. It was kind of really my first language until really getting into high school and having to speak proper, and then getting into college and so on.
It sounds a lot like a Caribbean dialect.
Yeah, it has some similarities. My mom is from Jamaica, so she speaks patois. So, growing up, we had patois in the house, then we had Hawaiian Pidgin, and then we had regular English as well. So it was an interesting childhood.
So you had an interesting background. Your mom was from Jamaica?
Yeah, my mom is from Jamaica, of Lebanese descent.
Okay.
A lot of Lebanese moved to Jamaica. They were kind of the Lebanese and Syrian at one time. They were the middle class, the merchant class, if you will. And so my mom grew up in Jamaica. My dad grew up in Hawaii. And then after Vietnam, my dad went to Canada for school. He joined the Canadian version of the Peace Corps and went to the West Indies to teach. And that's where he met my mom. And then they moved back to Canada. So I was actually born in Newfoundland. And then when I was about 6 months old, we moved back to Hawaii, and that's where I was raised.
Okay, you have a very interesting background. You've been all over the world. Warm places, cold
places. Yeah, definitely.
Ocean, beachfront, the Middle Eastern sands, all over the place.
All over.
So this is a question sort of out of left field. Do you think there should be a requirement for the president, who is the commander-in-chief of all military branches? Do you think should there be a requirement for the president to serve in the military in some capacity?
Yeah, that's an interesting, I think, discussion that many people have had, over the years. I don't think so. I mean, there's a danger of putting that requirement on any of our politicians, if you will, because you want diversity in our government. So you don't want a bunch of people who have been in nothing bad about the military. I'm in the military, but you don't want a bunch of people who've had this military experience to then, that's the only avenue maybe to get into politics, because then you bring that leaning towards military solutions to everything, right? If we have a bunch of people who've been in the military and now that's the requirement to then serve in Congress, become a president, whatever it is, then that's, unconsciously, that's probably going to be the answer to a lot of our problems when we're looking to deal with foreign adversaries or not, or just dealing with foreign partners. We're going to want to always subconsciously lean toward the military as a solution. So I think there's a real danger there to put that requirement on any of our politicians.
All right, so you teach military history. Is there any emotional connection between veterans and the names of the military bases? Or is there any historical imperative that the bases should be named after Confederate generals by any rationale?
Yeah, no, I'm a big Civil War buff. I really enjoy the American Civil War. Even though I didn't grow up around any battlefields, being in Hawaii, I have ancestors who served in the American Civil War, so I really enjoy that conflict time period, if you will. So do soldiers have an affinity towards the bases that they served in? Yeah, absolutely. If you're an airborne guy, then Fort Bragg, is a name that you have pride with, that you have proud memories of with, and so on. So the matter of the Confederate bases naming, I think it was the right thing to do, to change the names. The Confederates, there's two parts to that, right? Do we scrub that history of the Confederacy from studying military history, for example? I don't think so. I think you can separate what General Lee did, what an awesome general he was, a tactical operational general that he did on the battlefield, with his beliefs, right? You can not honor Lee, but study Lee and say, okay, yeah, these are some real lessons that I can learn from General Lee here. Then I can separate that from the fact that he was fighting for the enslavement of a whole other people. I can separate that, right? I don't need to erase that from my history. But I don't need to honor that with a base name. And I think that it was the right thing to do with removing those base names. So several of them have been changed back, but they're no longer named after that Confederate now. They're now a different Benning, or is it Benning? Yeah, Benning and Bragg are now named after a different person who was not in the Confederacy. So they bought that connection back, that pride that people have being at Fort Bragg, being at Fort Benning, and etc. But now it's uplifting a different American hero. So yeah, it seems multifaceted question, but the Confederates at the end of the day were traitors. So to honor them with a base name, a statue, or anything like that, I don't think is the right thing to do. But we also don't want to erase their history, because there are a lot of lessons that you can learn from Lee, Longstreet, how the Confederacy waged that conflict, and how it lasted as long as they did when they were when the North was superior in all areas, and still the South was able to prolong that conflict for 4+ years. How did they do that? There's a lot of lessons there that you can learn in leadership, tactics, etc. So again, just separating the two. Erasing the history, I don't think is the right thing to do, but not honoring it in a way where we honor those guys with statues and base names and so on, understanding that they were traitors, is the other side of that equation.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. We have to learn our lessons from history, or else we'll continue to repeat it. We talked about earlier that what we lose at the end of one war, we try to fix at the beginning of the next war. So it becomes a never-ending cycle. And here in Texas, the largest base was formerly called Fort Hood, which was named after a Civil War general, and recently renamed to Fort Cavazos. And I didn't know anything about Cavazos, and it caused me to go and start learning about him. And just incredible family. I don't know if you know much about him, but just
no, I do, and that's the way it should be, right? Those base names, those vehicles that we want to call, Apache and things like that, and those should invoke a pride in our history, right? It should cause the soldiers to look, who was Sergeant Major Cavazos? We should look that up and see and be able to take pride in that. So I think that was a right base name change as well.
Yeah. All right. So last question for you today. Why should all of my listeners buy your book?
Sure. So yeah, my book. So it covers, I think, everything that we just talked about. You asked some really good questions, some really powerful questions, and I'm glad that you did, and I appreciate that. And so my book goes into all of that. It's not just another war story. If you want war stories, it's in there. There's definitely tales from Vietnam, Iraq, and so on that are in there. But it talks about all the things that we just talked about. It talks about diversity in the military. It talks about the base name changes. It talks about who should be our heroes. It talks about the generational impact of conflict. So if that stuff, that societal piece, if you will, if that's something you're interested in, the book covers that in great detail as well. It covers the draft, it covers the volunteer army, it covers all those things. So that's in there. It also takes a national level look at war and talks about some of those similarities between Vietnam and the mistakes that we made between Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan. So that's in there as well. If you're like a big national security type buff, that's also in there. And then it talks about just the human experience of conflict as well. So if that interests you, it just talks about how that has influenced my father's generation, everybody that he served with, and then the whole family as a whole, and how that just spilled down into our generation, and then we went into our own war, and how that's now going to influence, my son, and how it's influenced my sister, and so on, and so all of that's in there. So I would really hope that it's a way to connect that fracture that we have, which we talked about earlier, of that people who just join the military over and over again, society, the generations over and over again, that small 1%. I want to try to connect to the rest of society as well, and I hope this book kind of bridges that gap a little bit. That's really the biggest thing I was trying to do with the book. And so there's something for everybody. My biggest fear is, Vietnam is kind of become what Korea was, that forgotten war, and so Vietnam is now kind of becoming that forgotten war. And I worry that those I served with in Iraq and Afghanistan, that's now going to become a forgotten war as well as we go into this new uncertain future and all the things that are happening now. And this is a way to memorialize all those who served in Vietnam and all those who served in Iraq and Afghanistan in my generation as well. So I hope all of that is attractive to readers out there. And at the end of the day, I hope it's a well written book, and I hope whoever picks it up and reads it gets what they want out of it and walks away with it with a little more understanding of both conflicts and how that has influenced our society as a whole, both within families and just from a larger perspective as well.
Well, I had the privilege of getting the pre-publication version of it, so thank you for that, and had a chance to read that. And again, it's very well written, and I highly encourage people to go out and get their own copies. It's available as of today, so go out and get a copy of Born from War. Our guest today has been military historian Patrick Naughton. There will be a link to his book in the show notes. So Patrick, thank you so much for being here today.
No, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation, and thanks for asking some tough and needed questions as well.
All right, thank you. Please go to my website at podcastreallife.com for more information about my guest and the things we discussed today. That's it for today's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another chance to learn from each other. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.
That was Stories from Real Life. Join us again next week for another great storytelling journey. See you next time.